My name is Lila Grant, and 3 weeks before my wedding, my mother used the word embarrassment to describe it. Not privately, not carefully. At Sunday dinner, in front of my father, my aunt, my younger cousin scrolling on her phone. This whole thing feels rushed, my mother said, folding her napkin with precision. And frankly, Lila, it's embarrassing. Embarrassing. Because we weren't getting married at a country club. Because my fiancé didn't come from our circle. Because Daniel Carter didn't wear tailored suits or shake hands like he was negotiating mergers. He wore boots. And he owned a construction company. A real one. The kind that builds foundations instead of portfolios. My father didn't argue with her. He just adjusted his cufflinks and said, "We always imagined something different for you. Different meant polished. Different meant connected. Different meant someone whose LinkedIn profile impressed their friends. Daniel doesn't have LinkedIn. He has calloused hands, a commercial contractor's license in 3 states, and a reputation for finishing jobs under budget." But to my parents, that translated to small. My mother continued, "You're choosing a warehouse reception with exposed beams. It's a restored industrial venue." I corrected. She waved her hand. "It looks unfinished." I looked at my father. "You've met Daniel. You know what he's built." My father smiled thinly. "We know what he does." That sentence said everything. They didn't know him. They didn't ask about the development he quietly co-owned. They didn't ask why half the new mixed-use properties downtown listed Carter Development Group in small print under the primary investor. They didn't care. Because in their world, image arrived before substance. The irony was this: Daniel never tried to impress them. He showed up to every dinner invitation they reluctantly sent. He listened. He stayed calm. He never corrected them when they referred to him as the contractor instead of the owner. On the drive home that night, I apologized. "They don't understand," I said quietly. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. They don't need to. That's when I knew something my parents didn't. Daniel wasn't threatened by them. He was measuring them. And 3 days before the wedding, my mother sent a group text to extended family. "We're doing something simple. Nothing extravagant. Simple." That word spread. By the time invitations were returned, attendance had quietly dropped. Because no one wants to attend an embarrassing wedding. But what my parents didn't realize was this. There was one photo circulating privately among Daniel's business partners that week. And if it ever reached the wrong eyes, the embarrassment would not belong to me 3 days before the wedding. My father called me into his office. Not the one at home, the one downtown with glass walls and framed awards from investment boards that no one outside his circle had heard of. He didn't offer coffee. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He slid his phone across the desk instead. "Explain this," he said calmly. On the screen was a photograph taken at a private development summit 2 weeks earlier. Daniel stood on a stage beside the mayor, 2 commercial lenders, and a real estate consortium that controlled nearly a quarter of the city's downtown expansion. Behind them was a projected rendering of a 40-story mixed-use tower. At the bottom of the image, in clean white lettering, "Lead structural partner, Carter Development Group." My last name wasn't Carter yet, but it would be. "It's a project he's involved in," I said evenly. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "Involved how?" I didn't answer immediately, because this was the part Daniel never advertised. He didn't just run a construction company. He owned controlling structural stakes in 3 urban redevelopment projects. He had leveraged early cash flow into equity positions quietly over the last decade. He never bragged about it. He never posted about it. He just built and reinvested. My father leaned back in his chair. "Why wasn't this mentioned?" "You never asked," I replied. The room shifted. For years, they had reduced Daniel to a trade. Now they were staring at a man who sat on panels with people they actively courted. "This doesn't change the wedding," my father said finally. But his tone had changed. It wasn't dismissal anymore. It was calculation. "No," I said calmly. "It doesn't." He studied the image again. The mayor smiling. Daniel composed, confident, not. Performing, leading. "Why isn't this public?" he asked. "Because he doesn't need it to be," I answered. That's when something subtle flickered in my father's expression. Not pride, not approval, concern, because if Daniel had that level of access quietly, it meant two things. One, they had underestimated him. Two, other people hadn't. Later that evening, my mother called. Her voice was softer than usual. "We heard about the downtown project," she said carefully. "It's impressive." I let the silence stretch. "Are you reconsidering calling the wedding embarrassing?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. "People talk," she said instead. "Yes, they do." And what they were saying now was very different from a week ago. But my parents still believed they could control the narrative. What they didn't understand was that the photo wasn't the surprise. It was only the preview. The morning of the wedding arrived quieter than I expected. No dramatic sunrise. No cinematic orchestra in the background. Just soft light coming through the windows of the restored warehouse my mother had called. Unfinished, exposed beams, brick walls, polished concrete floors, intentional, strong, honest, exactly like Daniel. I stood near the balcony, overlooking the main floor while vendors finalized the floral. Installations, greenery cascaded from iron rafters. Edison lights glowed warm against the brick. It wasn't flashy. It was powerful. At noon, the first shift happened. 3 RSVPs that had been marked regretfully declined suddenly reversed. Then 2 more. Then a call from my aunt asking if it was too late to attend. My cousin texted Mia. Screenshot from a local business blog. The same photo my father had shown me was now circulating publicly. Headline: Carter Development Group secures major structural role in downtown expansion. Daniel hadn't posted it. The city did. Within hours, the narrative flipped. The wedding that was simple was suddenly strategic. The groom, who was just a contractor, was now a major player in urban redevelopment. My mother arrived early. Too early. She walked in, scanning the space differently than she had at the rehearsal dinner. Not critical, evaluating. "It photographs well," she said carefully. That was her version of an apology. I smiled politely. It was always going to. My father entered moments later, phone in hand, responding to messages. I watched his expression as he moved through the venue. Guests he had assumed wouldn't come were now confirming attendance. A city council member, a private equity advisor, a developer he had tried to partner with for years. They weren't coming for him. They were coming for Daniel. "You didn't tell us the scale," my father said quietly when he reached me. "You didn't ask," I replied again. That sentence had become the rhythm of the week. By 4 o'clock, the seating chart had shifted twice. Not because we invited new people, because the people who once declined were suddenly rearranging themselves closer to the front. Reputation travels faster than invitations. I found Daniel in a quiet corner near the loading dock entrance, adjusting his cufflinks. Not expensive, not designer, simple silver. "It's getting crowded," I told him. He nodded once, calm, grounded. "It was always going to," he said. I studied him for a moment. "Did you expect this?" "No," he replied honestly. "But I expected correction." Correction. That word lingered. Because that's what this was. Not revenge and not exposure. Correction. My parents had called the wedding an embarrassment. Now they were watching the room, filled with people who understood exactly what Daniel represented. And the ceremony hadn't even started yet. By the time the ceremony began, every seat was filled. Not politely filled, intentionally filled. The kind of attendance that shifts energy in a room. Conversations had changed tone. People weren't whispering about exposed brick anymore. They were discussing projected returns, zoning approvals, and the structural innovation behind mixed-use towers. I stood behind the sliding steel doors with my father waiting. For the music cue, he adjusted his tie twice in under a minute, a nervous habit he only had when he wasn't in control. "You could have told us," he said quietly, not looking at me, "about Daniel's skill." I kept my eyes forward. It wouldn't have mattered. That silence between us wasn't anger. It was realization. The door slid open. Light poured across the aisle. Daniel stood at the front, composed, steady, not performing for anyone, not trying to impress. The sudden wave of high profile guests who had appeared once the photo circulated. He looked exactly the same as he had at Sunday dinners when my mother criticized the venue, and my father called him the contractor. The only difference was perception. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed something subtle but undeniable. People were watching him differently now, not as an accessory to me, not as a risk, as an asset. That shift had nothing to do with the venue, the flowers, or the guest list. It had to do with information. My mother sat in the front row, posture straighter than usual. Not proud, strategic. My father's handshake with Daniel at the altar was firmer than rehearsed, longer than necessary. A public recalibration. The officiant began speaking about partnership, foundation, and resilience. I almost smiled at the choice of words. Foundation, the very thing Daniel built, professionally and personally. When we exchanged vows, Daniel's voice didn't waver. "I choose you," he said simply. No dramatic flourish, no performance, just certainty. I realized then why none of this chaos touched him. He had never needed their approval to validate his success. He had already built what mattered. When the officiant pronounced us married, the applause was loud, but not for spectacle, for alignment. As we walked back down the aisle together, I caught my father glancing at his phone again. Messages still coming in. Congratulations, interest, invitations, for years. They worried my wedding would embarrass them. Now they were calculating how it elevated them. And that difference was louder than any music playing in the room. The reception hadn't even started yet, and the panic was only beginning. The reception began with soft, jazz and controlled conversation, but the energy underneath was sharper than the music. Clusters of guests formed quickly, developers near the bar, city officials near the balcony, investors at the high tables overlooking. The floor. My parents moved through the room carefully, shaking hands with people they hadn't expected to see. People who had once declined the invitation were now complimenting the vision of the venue. I watched my mother adjust her tone mid-sentence when she realized one of Daniel's partners was standing beside her. She went from dismissive politeness to strategic warmth in seconds. My father, meanwhile, was cornered near the catering station by a man he had tried to secure a deal with last year. I caught a fragment of the conversation. "Didn't realize Carter was your son-in-law," the man said. My father forced a controlled smile. Yes, we've known about his expansion plans for some time. That wasn't true, but it sounded better than admitting they hadn't. When dinner was served, Daniel gave a short thank you speech. Nothing extravagant, no public flex. He thanked the contractors who restored the building. He thanked our families. He thanked me. He did not mention the tower. He did not mention the summit. He did not mention equity positions. That restraint unsettled my parents more than any bragging would have, because silence leaves room for imagination, and imagination magnifies scale. Halfway through the second course, my mother leaned toward me. "People keep asking about the downtown project," she whispered. "Are there more?" I sipped my water calmly. "There are always more." She stared at me for a moment, recalculating. My father approached the table shortly after, posture tight. "You should have prepared us," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For this level." There it was. Again, level. as if status were an elevator and they had misjudged which floor Daniel occupied. Across the room, I noticed two council members speaking directly with him, their body language deferential. Daniel wasn't performing dominance. He was listening, nodding, occasionally offering measured responses. The room adjusted around him naturally. That was the real panic. Not that he was wealthy, not that he was connected, but that he didn't need to display either. My parents had spent years curating image. Daniel had spent years compounding position, and now, in a warehouse they once called embarrassing, the most powerful people in the room were orbiting the man they underestimated. The cake hadn't been cut yet, and my parents were already realizing something irreversible. They hadn't just misjudged a groom, they had misjudged leverage. After the cake was cut, the room opened up for casual conversation, and my parents circulated with visible recalibration in their movements. My father shook hands with a commercial lender he had been chasing for 2 years, and the lender mentioned Daniel's name before my father's, your son-in-law's structural partnership on the Millstone project is remarkable, he said. Quiet execution. Rare quality, my father nodded politely, absorbing the weight of those words. Rare quality. The same man he once called just a contractor was now being praised by people whose opinions shaped entire markets. My mother drifted toward the dessert table, where two women from her social circle were speaking in hushed tones. I caught fragments as I passed. He owns the structural stake, one whispered. Not just owns, the other corrected. He negotiated the equity directly. No broker, no middleman. My mother's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She picked up a dessert plate she had no intention of eating and returned to our table with manufactured composure. Lila, she said carefully, how long has Daniel been involved in development projects? I set my fork down. Since before we dated. The silence that followed carried the weight of 7 years of dismissal, 7 years of whispered embarrassment, 7 years of treating the man who would eventually sit across from city officials like a cautionary tale. My father appeared moments later, pulling a chair close. His voice was low but controlled. The councilman just told me, Carter Development has a pipeline worth over 80 million in projected value. I didn't respond immediately. I let him sit with the number. He also mentioned that Daniel personally structured the financing on 2 of those projects. My father continued, without institutional backing. That detail landed harder than the dollar figure, because without institutional backing meant Daniel had used his own capital, his own leverage, his own calculation. No safety net, no inherited advantage, just discipline and positioning. My father exhaled slowly. We were wrong about him. 4 words, simple, heavy, late. I looked at him evenly. Yes, you were. He didn't argue. He didn't qualify it. He just sat there recalibrating the entire narrative he had constructed about his daughter's husband. Across the room, Daniel was standing near the exit, talking to a developer who specialized in agricultural land conversion. Not selling anything, not pitching, just exchanging ideas. That was the part my parents never understood about him. He wasn't building relationships. He was building infrastructure. And infrastructure outlasts reputation. My mother returned to the table and sat down without speaking. For the first time in my adult life, she looked uncertain. Not dramatic uncertainty. The quiet kind that comes when you realize the story you told yourself was wrong. The band started playing again. Guests swayed. Laughter filled the warehouse that had been called embarrassing 3 weeks ago. My parents sat in silence, watching the man they mocked move through a room full of people who understood his value. The panic wasn't loud. It was internal, and it was permanent. The confrontation didn't happen in the middle of the dance floor. My parents would never choose a public collapse. It happened in a side corridor, near the coat racks where the lighting was softer and the music felt distant. My father asked if we could have a moment. Daniel agreed without hesitation. That calmness unsettled them more than defensiveness would have. My mother folded her hands in front of her, posture tight. "We owe you an apology," she began. The sentence sounded unfamiliar in her voice. Daniel didn't interrupt. My father continued, "We made assumptions about your ambitions, about your scale, about your..." He paused, searching for the right word. Capacity. Daniel's expression didn't change. "You made conclusions without information," he said evenly. It wasn't accusation. It was assessment. My mother stepped closer. "We were trying to protect Lila." I almost laughed. But I didn't. Protect me from what? Stability, ownership, discipline. Daniel met her eyes. "From what?" he asked calmly. She didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that didn't expose pride. My father exhaled slowly. "The circles we move in value presentation," he said. "We assumed that presentation equals substance," Daniel finished. The quiet precision of that statement cut deeper than any raised voice could have. My father nodded once. Yes, silence settled between the four of us. Not hostile, just honest. For 7 years they had spoken about Daniel like he was a temporary chapter in my life, a risk, a downgrade. Now they were standing in a warehouse filled with decision makers who treated him like a strategic equal. My mother's voice softened. "You could have told us." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I didn't need to." That was the moment everything crystallized. He hadn't hidden his success. He simply hadn't performed it. He didn't attend dinners to advertise balance sheets. He came because I asked him to. He tolerated dismissal because it wasn't expensive to him. My father studied him for a long second. "Why didn't you ever correct us?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because people who need correction rarely accept it." The air shifted. Not explosive, transformative. My mother's composure finally cracked. "We called this wedding embarrassing," she said quietly. "We shouldn't have." Daniel's tone remained steady. It was never about the wedding. That truth hung there between us. It was about hierarchy, image, control, and losing it. My father straightened slightly. "We underestimated you." Daniel nodded once. Yes, no bitterness, no gloating, just acknowledgement. In that narrow hallway, away from applause and investment chatter, something irreversible happened. My parents weren't apologizing because he was wealthy. They were apologizing because they realized wealth had never been the point. The point was character, and that was the one asset they had. Mispriced from the beginning, the twist didn't explode. It unfolded quietly, the way Daniel prefers everything important to unfold. After the conversation in the corridor, we returned to the reception floor. The music had shifted to something slower. Conversations were deeper now, more intentional. My father stayed unusually close to Daniel for the next 20 minutes, introducing him differently than he had earlier in the evening. "This is my son-in-law, Daniel Carter," he said. Not the contractor, not Lila's husband, just his name, delivered with weight. I watched the recalibration in real time, but the real shift came when Daniel's phone buzzed and he glanced down at it. He didn't react dramatically. He never does. He just excused himself briefly and stepped toward the balcony overlooking the main floor. I followed a moment later. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly. He handed me the screen. It was an email confirmation, a signed acquisition agreement. I asked quietly. He handed me the screen. It was an email confirmation, a signed acquisition agreement. One of the parcels, adjacent to the downtown tower. Project had just transferred under Carter Development Group's control. The closing date, today, during our wedding reception. My breath caught slightly. "You closed it now?" I asked. He nodded once. Timing mattered. It took me a second to understand. The photo that had circulated earlier in the week showed him as a structural partner. This acquisition made him majority controlling stakeholder in the surrounding infrastructure. The scale had just multiplied. He wasn't just involved in the project. He effectively controlled its structural timeline. And the mayor standing downstairs congratulating guests. He didn't know yet. Daniel slipped his phone back into his pocket. "You planned this," I said softly. "I planned growth," he corrected. We returned inside. Word traveled faster than announcements. Within 15 minutes, one of the commercial lenders approached Daniel with visible urgency. I watched the conversation unfold. The lender's posture changed mid-sentence. Respect shifted to something closer to strategic caution. My father noticed it too. He drifted closer, listening without interrupting. When the lender left, my father turned to Daniel. "You increased your stake?" he asked carefully. Daniel nodded. "Yes." "When?" "This afternoon." Silence again. But this time it wasn't panic. It was awe. My father's expression moved through calculation, surprise, and finally acceptance. "You chose today intentionally," he said. Daniel's reply was simple. "I chose the right moment." Across the room, my mother was speaking animatedly with one of her friends, likely repeating the new information she had just learned. The narrative had fully reversed now. The wedding once labeled embarrassing had become a strategic milestone. And my parents were no longer trying to manage perception. They were trying to understand scale. But the biggest twist wasn't the acquisition. It was this. Daniel had never needed this moment to prove anything. He closed the deal today because it aligned with financing cycles and leverage points. Not because of them. The panic was gone. In its place was something heavier. Respect earned without performance. My parents stayed later than everyone else. Not out of obligation, but out of something that felt like respect earned slowly over the course of the night. My mother hugged me first, her hold tighter than usual. And when she pulled back, she didn't comment on the concrete floors or the exposed beams. "I'm sorry," she said simply. And for the first time in my life, the apology didn't come with a condition attached. "No, but this venue is so," or "but Daniel is very," just 2 words. Spoken without performance. My father shook Daniel's hand again, and this time the shake lasted a bit longer than social custom dictated. "I'd like to sit down next week," he said. "Talk about alignment on the West Corridor parcels." No pressure. It wasn't a request for favor. It was an offer of partnership, extended as equals. Daniel nodded once. "I'll have my assistant send time options. No grand celebration. No dramatic speech declaring victory." That's not how he operates. We drove away from the reception as dried flower confetti drifted across the parking lot. My dress crumpled slightly at the hem. Daniel's tie loosened after 12 hours of handshakes and conversations. He held my hand across the center console, exactly the same way he had when we left my parents' dinner after they first called our wedding embarrassing. "Did you ever want to say something sooner?" I asked him as we turned onto the highway. He was quiet for a moment, watching streetlights bleed gold across the windshield. "Why would I?" He replied finally. "People who believe they're above you don't listen when you talk. They watch when you build." That sentence stayed with me long after we got home. For months after the wedding, I still heard faint echoes of the old comments. The whispers about simple venues and contractor husbands. The quiet assumptions that I had chosen a smaller life. But as the months passed, those whispers stopped. The same family members who had declined our RSVPs now asked for invitations to our housewarming. The same social circle. Friends who had called the venue unfinished now called it iconic. Ahead of the curve, no one used the word embarrassment anymore. It had been replaced by another word, foresight, a year later. When I walked through that same warehouse space now rented out months in advance for corporate, galas, and charity events, I sometimes pause in the center of the floor and remember. The night it was called embarrassing. The brick hasn't changed. The beams are still exposed. The structure is still honest. The only thing that changed was perception. My parents visit often now, not to inspect, not to evaluate, just to sit. My mother once ran her hand along the brick wall and said, almost to herself, it was never unfinished. It was intentional. That quiet admission meant more than any public apology ever could. My father did meet with Daniel about the West Corridor parcels. They didn't merge companies. They didn't announce partnerships. But they did collaborate carefully, respectfully, professionally. My father no longer introduces Daniel with qualifiers. He says his name with clarity. This is Daniel Carter. He leads Carter Development. There's no hesitation anymore. No adjustment of cufflinks. Just recognition. The photo that once caused panic now hangs framed in Daniel's office. Not because it impressed anyone, but because it marked the moment perception corrected itself. The real milestone wasn't the acquisition. It wasn't the valuation. It wasn't the wedding guest list shifting in real time. It was the shift in hierarchy. For years, my parents believed power came from image, from curated rooms and familiar last names. Daniel believed power came from ownership, from leverage, from building foundations that didn't require applause. And when those two philosophies collided, only one held steady. I used to think the most satisfying part of this story would be watching my parents panic. I was wrong. The most powerful part was watching them adjust, watching pride give way to perspective, watching assumption turn into respect. Because correction without destruction is rare. Daniel could have humiliated them publicly. He could have exposed every misjudgment with a speech or a headline. Instead, he let numbers speak and silence do the rest. Now, when people ask about our wedding, they call it visionary, ahead of its time, a statement. I just smile. It was never a statement. It was simply aligned with who we are. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. When someone calls your life an embarrassment, they're usually measuring it with the wrong ruler. Keep building anyway. Let them talk. Let them underestimate. Because eventually, perception catches up to structure. And when it does, the people who once looked down, you won't panic because you proved them wrong. They'll panic because they realize you were never beneath them at all.